Nietzsche never believed in innocent, pure or selfless love. To him, behind every tender gesture, every passionate surrender, there exists a silent struggle for power. Love, more than a meeting of souls, would be a battlefield where wills are measured, where desires seek to prevail, and where fragility is quickly transformed into a weapon. The philosopher never wrote to comfort us, but to destabilize us. What if what we call true love were in reality just a refined form of domination? What if the desire to be with someone wasn't altruistic, but the longing to possess, control and mold the other? These ideas disturb because they touch something we try to hide from ourselves, that even in the sweetest moments we seek to win. And Nietzsche invites us to look into this abyss without fear. Nietzsche deeply distrusted love, especially when it was painted as something sublime, altruistic and pure. For him, this purity was just a mask, a way to disguise what really happens between two people, a dispute of forces, a need for affirmation and power. When someone says, "I love you," there is almost always, hidden behind those words, the demand to be loved back, to be recognized, to become indispensable to the other. Loving, in this sense, is not surrendering oneself, but conquering, expanding one's own territory into another person's life. Think about how we usually talk about love. We say we want to belong to someone, or that we wish someone to be ours. The language already betrays this will to possess, but we rarely notice. Nietzsche would say that love is a refined strategy of the will to power, that force that moves us to always want more, to surpass limits, to not be content with merely existing. Loving would be, then, one of the most beautiful disguises that power found to express itself. In daily life, this game appears in small situations. When someone feels jealous, it's not just fear of losing the other's affection, but fear of losing dominion over them. When someone demands exclusivity, it's often not for security, but because they desire the other to be submitted to their own value. Love from this point of view doesn't liberate, but imprisons, and the prison is sustained by gestures of affection, eternal promises, and passionate declarations. Nietzsche didn't want to destroy love with this, but to invite us to look at it without naivety. He saw the danger of believing that loving is an act of purity, because this belief makes us blind to the manipulations that happen in intimacy. The person who believes they're living selfless love can, without realizing, be both dominating and being dominated. It's in this veil of innocence that the most violent relationships, emotionally speaking, are built. Imagine two people in a relationship. One of them strives to please all the time, always willing to give in, to annul themselves, believing this is proving love. But behind this surrender, there's a hidden desire to keep the other trapped in the obligation to recognize such sacrifice. The mask is of purity, but the essence is of power. The other, in turn, might use this devotion to reinforce their control, demanding more and more proofs, more and more submission. Thus, the dynamic sustains itself. One dominates through demand, the other dominates through fragility. Nietzsche alerts us to this aspect precisely because he shows us how much love, when not examined, can become a theater of masks. We perform roles, speak about surrender, but the background is always the search for affirmation. It's no coincidence that so many couples oscillate between passion and resentment. What we call eternal love is often nothing more than a long, silent dispute to see who molds whom, who influences more, who manages to impose their will with more subtlety. Looking at love this way may sound cynical, almost cruel, but Nietzsche believed that the cruelty of looking truth in the face is the only path to freedom. Only when we remove the mask can we choose to live love more consciously, without illusions that weaken us. The question that remains is, are we ready to admit that even the sweetest of feelings can be just an arena of power? Perhaps this admission is painful, but it's also liberating. Because by perceiving the mask, we can choose how to use it. We can recognize that there's power in every relationship, but instead of hiding this, we can transform this energy into something creative. Love doesn't need to be just prison. It can also be expansion if it has the courage not to hide behind false purities. Nietzsche doesn't ask us to abandon love, but to unmask it, so it doesn't deceive us and doesn't make us slaves of an illusion. Nietzsche saw human desire as an insatiable force, always in movement, always seeking expansion. When we talk about desire in the context of love, we tend to imagine something romantic, the impulse to be together, to share, to unite. But for Nietzsche, desire was never simple search for fusion. It is, above all, will to possess. Loving someone in practice means wanting to integrate them into one's own world, to mold their presence, to make them part of oneself. The discourse of surrender, when examined more carefully, hides the raw truth. To love is to want to capture. The word possession may seem harsh, but just observe how we relate. When we're in love, we're not content to merely admire the other person from afar. We want proximity, we want exclusivity, we want them to organize their life around ours. We want, in a certain sense, for them to belong to us. We don't easily accept that the other has independent desires, autonomous paths, choices that don't include our name. Love, when seen from outside, resembles an invisible contract of mutual appropriation, where each gesture and each decision is measured by the impact it will have on the relationship. Nietzsche would say, there's no love without this longing for power. Even the most altruistic of gestures carries within it a hidden demand. When someone offers care, protection, or sacrifice, they expect in return, even if unconsciously, recognition and gratitude. It's not something cold or calculated, but an almost instinctive law of life. No one gives themselves without expecting return, even if that return is the sensation of being necessary, of being indispensable to the other. Possession, in this case, isn't just material, it's also emotional, spiritual, symbolic. In daily life, we see this in relationships that seem normal. A couple can share dreams, build projects, divide responsibilities, but within this arrangement, each one watches the other, even if subtly. A career decision, a new friendship, an unexpected hobby. All this can awaken distrust or discomfort, because it means the other is moving outside the field of possession. It's as if there were an invisible line marking territory. Whoever loves wants somehow to guarantee that the other remains within this delimited space. Nietzsche was aware that this aspect isn't something we can simply eliminate. The will to possess is an expression of life itself, of what he called will to power. To love without desiring to possess would be like living without breathing. The question then isn't to deny this reality, but to recognize it. When we believe our love is totally pure, free from selfishness, we're just deceiving ourselves. And deception makes us fragile because it opens space for manipulation, resentment, and frustration. A common example is jealousy. We usually treat it as a sign of love, but in Nietzsche's light, it's the clearest manifestation of the will to possess. We feel jealous because we want the other to be ours, for their gazes, words, and desires to be directed only toward us. If the other shows interest in something or someone outside this invisible pact, we feel our dominion has been violated. Jealousy, therefore, isn't just insecurity. It's the pain of perceiving that our possession isn't absolute. Another example is idealization. When someone falls in love, they often project an ideal image onto the other, molding them according to their expectations. But this idealization isn't an innocent act. It's an attempt to transform the beloved person into something we can control. We want them to fit the narrative we've built, and any deviation from this image can provoke disappointment or anger. Loving, in this case, is desiring that the other be exactly what we need, and not what they are in their singularity. Nietzsche didn't see this as a moral defect, but as an inevitable truth of the human condition. To pretend we love without desire for possession would be hypocrisy. True liberation for him would come from facing this fact head-on and asking, what will we do with this will? Will we transform it into prison or into creative force? This dilemma leads us to reflect on different ways of living love. In many cases, possession transforms into suffocating dominion. One partner controls the other's steps, limits their freedom, demands constant proof of fidelity. Love becomes a prison, where life loses space to breathe. In other cases, however, this same will to possess can transform into creative impulse. The desire to have the other close can inspire joint projects, mutual growth, construction of something greater than each individual alone. The difference lies in how we deal with this force. Nietzsche believed that life is made of power struggles, but not every struggle needs to be destructive. Love, when recognized as desire for possession, can stop being a naive farce and become an experience of conscious intensity. We can accept that we desire the other, that we want to influence them, that we seek to be important to them. But by admitting this, we can also open space for the other to do the same with us, without need for masks. Thus, love stops being a game of lies and transforms into an honest duel of wills. Perhaps Nietzsche's great provocation lies precisely there. There's no love without power, but there's power that can generate life instead of destruction. The question we need to ask ourselves is, when we love, are we trying to imprison the other in our chains, or are we inviting them to walk alongside us as a force that challenges and magnifies us? Possession is inevitable, but what we choose to do with it can determine whether our love will be a prison or a source of vitality. When Nietzsche speaks of love as a field of domination, he's not referring only to explicit gestures of control. He also points to what happens backstage, in silence, in glances, in the absence of words. Love, according to him, is a stage where an invisible game of forces unfolds, a subtle and constant dispute where we don't always perceive we're playing. The passion that seems innocent, the surrender that seems pure, frequently hide delicate strategies of power. It's at this point that love shows itself most disturbing. We don't need to raise our voice, impose orders, or threaten to dominate. Many times, we dominate precisely through subtlety, through waiting, through emotional manipulation disguised as care. Think of a common situation. Someone remains silent after an argument. This silence isn't empty. It's a weapon, a way to make the other feel guilt, discomfort, or obligation to approach. It's power exercised without words. Nietzsche would invite us to perceive how these microdynamics shape our relationships. The jealousy already mentioned is just a visible example. But there are even more silent forces. When someone feigns indifference to provoke insecurity in their partner, when an exaggerated declaration of love comes loaded with expectation of reciprocation, when a gesture of generosity is offered to trap the other in the debt of gratitude. All these are forms of power disguised as affection. And what's most disturbing is that we rarely do this consciously. It's not that we plan to manipulate, but that the will to power itself infiltrates the smallest details. To love is to want to be important, and to maintain this importance, we end up learning, often without realizing, to use emotional weapons. This invisible game of forces doesn't happen only in major crises, but in daily life, in how we ask for attention, in how we react to absence, in how we interpret silences. Nietzsche doesn't describe these dynamics to condemn love, but to reveal its real nature. He wanted us to stop idealizing relationships as spaces of pure harmony, because this idealization makes us blind and vulnerable. Love, in his view, is a delicate combat, and like every combat, it can both strengthen and destroy. An example that illustrates this game well is the dispute over who gives in more in a relationship. At first sight, it might seem like a competition of generosity, but deep down, there's power in this. Whoever gives in too much can charge in the future, demand recognition for the sacrifice, create resentment when their renunciation isn't properly valued. Love, then, becomes an invisible accounting system, where each gesture is weighed and each silence is interpreted as victory or defeat. Another example is in the control of affections. Many people learn to regulate their demonstrations of affection to keep the other in a state of tension. Showing affection in a calculated way can be a manner of maintaining the partner's attention, of making them always long for more, of never feeling completely satisfied. It's like giving water to someone thirsty, but never letting them drink until they're sated. This game of emotional scarcity is perhaps one of the most subtle and cruel forms of power within love. Nietzsche challenges us to perceive what we call romance is often just the visible surface of this invisible battlefield. The flowers, passionate messages, eternal promises, all this can be sincere, but can also be part of an unconscious strategy to guarantee dominion, to keep the other captive. It's not about denying affection, but recognizing that it almost always carries hidden intentions with it. The question isn't just that we seek to dominate, but that we also accept being dominated, as long as this domination gives us the sensation of security. Many people prefer relationships where the game of forces is clear, even if painful, to living in the uncertainty of freedom. To love, for many, is to give up autonomy in exchange for belonging. And this is perhaps the central paradox of love. We want both to control and to be controlled, as long as this gives us the illusion of stability. Nietzsche saw in this dynamic an opportunity for awakening. When we perceive that love is made of invisible forces, we can choose to play with more consciousness. We can abandon the naivety that weakens us and learn to recognize when we're being manipulated or when we're manipulating. This lucidity doesn't eliminate the game, but gives us more freedom within it. Love, then, stops being an idealized farce and becomes an arena where two wills meet. And if both have the courage to admit the game, they can transform the dispute into mutual growth. But if they insist on the illusion of purity, they run the risk of getting lost in silent resentments and invisible chains. Nietzsche, by revealing this field of forces, doesn't ask us to abandon love. On the contrary, he challenges us to love it even more intensely, but without lies. To love isn't to deny power, but to recognize that it's always present. What we do with this power is the decisive question. Either we transform it into prison or into space for creation. Perhaps the great provocation of this chapter is to ask, to what extent have your relationships been guided by gestures of sincere affection, and to what extent have they been moved by invisible games of power? Recognizing this question is the first step to taking love out of the shadow of masks and bringing it into the light of consciousness. Nietzsche didn't believe that love was by nature something curative or redemptive. On the contrary, he knew that many times love transforms into sickness, into prison, into a form of resentment. When the will to power expresses itself in a fragile and distorted manner, what should be a source of intensity can convert into unbearable weight. It's at this point that love stops being creative force and becomes a symptom of weakness, of fear, of dependence. To love can make one sick when it's confused with necessity. Whoever loves expecting the other to be the solution to their incompleteness inevitably becomes a prisoner. Instead of encounter, dependence is created. Instead of strength, fragility is created. And it's precisely in this dependence that resentment is born. First, we venerate the other as savior, then we blame them for not having filled our voids. Nietzsche would call this decadent love, a love that weakens instead of strengthening. Think of common situations. A person who demands constant attention, who measures the value of the relationship by the number of messages received, by the intensity of gestures, by daily presence. This type of love isn't celebration of the other, but incessant demand. The partner becomes less a person and more a function, the function of supplying deficiencies. And when this function fails, accusation arises, drama, emotional blackmail. Love then becomes sick because it's not sustained in vitality, but in lack. Nietzsche would say that resentment is one of the strongest poisons in this process. When we love expecting return, each unrecognized gesture becomes debt. Each absence transforms into ingratitude. The relationship becomes a silent tribunal where every detail is judged. Whoever lives in this state doesn't truly love. They merely negotiate affection in search of compensations. Love, which should be expansion, converts into emotional accounting, and the soul drowns in the repetition of sorrows. Another point where love becomes sick is when it transforms into absolute possession. The desire for exclusivity can be natural, but taken to the extreme, it suffocates both who loves and who is loved. Obsessive control arises, surveillance of every step, constant distrust, the need to confirm fidelity at every instant. To love in this case isn't freedom, but prison. The other stops being an individual and becomes property, and no life flourishes when reduced to an object of possession. Nietzsche saw in these sick forms of love an expression of modern decadence. People incapable of bearing solitude, of dealing with their own abysses, seek in the other a refuge, a relief. But love that's born from this flight cannot be healthy because it's rooted in fear. To love out of fear of being alone is the same as transforming the partner into a crutch, and every crutch, sooner or later, breaks. It's important to perceive that the sickening of love doesn't happen abruptly. Many times, it begins with small concessions, small sacrifices, small blackmails accepted in the name of peace. Little by little, the relationship loses the freshness of spontaneity and transforms into obligation. Laughter becomes demand, silence becomes threat, intimacy becomes debt. At this point, love no longer nourishes life but consumes it. Nietzsche wouldn't tell us to avoid love, but to transform it. He believed that loving should be an expression of strength, not weakness. Healthy love is that which is born from an individual who is already self-sufficient, who doesn't need the other to exist, but who, even so, chooses to share their intensity. When love is choice and not necessity, it strengthens. But when it's flight from solitude, it becomes sick. This vision may seem harsh because it challenges one of the most popular beliefs, that true love is that which completes us. For Nietzsche, this idea is dangerous because it starts from the premise that we are incomplete. Love, in this case, stops being encounter and becomes patch, and a patch never manages to sustain an entire life. To love, in order to complete oneself, is to transform the other into anesthesia for our own fragility. It's at this point that Nietzsche calls us to courage, the courage to look inward and bear solitude. Only those who don't fear their own solitude can love freely, because they don't demand that the other fill what only life itself can fill. This is the antidote against the sickening of love, not seeking salvation in the partner, but finding it in oneself. Sick love is love that imprisons, that charges, that suffocates. Healthy love is love that expands, that challenges, that magnifies. The frontier between one and the other is subtle, but decisive. The question Nietzsche would leave us here is disturbing. Does the love we live strengthen us or only reveal our incapacity to walk alone? Perhaps the answer isn't easy, but facing this doubt is already the first step to not becoming sick within what should be a source of life. Recognizing that love can become sickness gives us the chance to transform it into strength. But for this, courage is needed. Courage not to hide behind dependence, courage not to drown in resentment, courage to love without needing to imprison. Nietzsche never wanted us to abandon love, however cruel his analysis was. He knew that this force, when faced with courage, could become not just prison, but also creation. The problem wasn't in love itself, but in the way we live it. If we use it as refuge from our weakness, it makes us sick. If we assume it as expression of potency, it magnifies us. It's at this point that the possibility of creative love arises. A love that doesn't seek to imprison, but to expand, that doesn't feed on lack, but on abundance. Creative love isn't born from the need to complete oneself in the other, but from the choice to share what is already full. Whoever loves this way doesn't seek a crutch, but a dance partner. They don't demand that the other cure wounds, but that they walk side by side toward growth. Nietzsche would say this type of love is only possible for those who have already faced their own solitude, for those who learn to be self-sufficient. The fragile individual seeks the other as medicine. The strong individual seeks the other as challenge. In daily life, creative love appears in subtle but powerful gestures. It's when someone supports their partner in their projects without transforming them into a threat to the relationship. It's when the other's freedom isn't seen as betrayal, but as a sign of vitality. It's when presence doesn't suffocate, but inspires. To love creatively is to desire that the other flourish, even if this flower isn't always in our hands. Nietzsche saw creative love as the possibility of transforming the will to power into joint force. To love doesn't mean stopping disputing power. This would be denying life. It means rather recognizing that power can be shared, that struggle can be inspiring. Instead of seeking submission, creative love seeks confrontation that strengthens. It's like two mountains that, instead of crushing each other, rise side by side, each imposing its grandeur. This idea may seem strange at first sight because we're accustomed to thinking of love as harmony, fusion, unity. But Nietzsche distrusted this vision. He knew that fusion often means erasure, that unity frequently hides submission. Creative love, on the contrary, doesn't erase differences, but values them. It doesn't seek to annul the other, but to put them in living confrontation, where each challenges the other to be more. A clear example is in relationships where both grow together. Think of two partners who support each other in their individual choices, even when these choices seem divergent. Instead of limiting, they instigate each other. Instead of feeling jealous of freedom, they celebrate it. In this type of love, there are conflicts, yes, but they're fertile conflicts that generate movement, that prevent stagnation. Nietzsche would see there the true force of love, not avoiding shock, but transforming shock into creation. This way of loving requires courage, because it means giving up security. Creative love doesn't offer guarantees, doesn't promise eternity. It lives in risk, in uncertainty, in the constant flow of life. And precisely because of this, it's truer. Whoever loves creatively doesn't say, "You're mine forever." They say instead, "Today I choose to be with you, and may this choice be so intense that it doesn't need eternity to have value." Nietzsche believed this type of love was linked to the affirmation of life in its totality. To love creatively is to accept that the other is free, that they can leave, that they can change. It's loving not despite the risk, but precisely because of it. Life is risk, and creative love is the most radical expression of this acceptance. However, living this love isn't simple. It requires that we abandon the illusions that comfort us, the idea that someone will complete us, the promise of eternal fidelity, the security that we'll never be abandoned. Creative love doesn't make promises. It is rather present intensity. It's flame that doesn't fear extinguishing because it knows its beauty is in the brightness of the instant. This love may seem frightening to those accustomed to guarantees, but Nietzsche would say it's the only love worthy of strong spirits. To love creatively is not to fear losing because one no longer loves to possess. It's not to fear changing because one no longer loves to fix. It's not to fear pain, because one has already understood that even pain can be fecund. The question Nietzsche would leave us at this point is challenging. Are we prepared to love without hiding behind possession and lack? Are we ready to love as force that expands and not as weakness that clings? To love creatively is to embrace life in its imperfection, is to accept the other's freedom and even so choose to be together. It is ultimately an act of courage, perhaps the most difficult and most beautiful of all. For Nietzsche, life isn't something that needs to be justified by future rewards, nor something that should be denied in the name of transcendent ideals. Life is affirmation, excess, risk, creation. If love is one of the most intense experiences of existence, it can only be lived fully when it also becomes an affirmation of life. This means that to love isn't to flee from reality in search of security, but to dive into the chaos of existence with courage. To love as affirmation of life isn't to love to protect oneself, to complete oneself, or to save oneself. It's to love as one who says yes to the world, with everything it has of pain, uncertainty, and impermanence. Nietzsche saw in affirmative love the possibility of transforming even suffering into strength. When we love this way, we don't demand that the other eliminate our solitude or our failures, but we receive them as part of the adventure of living, with all its tensions and risks. This affirmative love doesn't promise eternity, but intensity. It doesn't need to swear unbreakable fidelity because it knows the value of an encounter is in the present and not in a future projection. Nietzsche distrusted eternal promises precisely because they deny change, transformation, impermanence, essential elements of life. To love affirmatively is to embrace movement, not to cling to illusions of stability. In daily life, this means accepting that the other won't always be the same, and that we too will change. To love isn't to freeze an image, but to walk together in the flow of time. It's to allow the other to flourish in unexpected directions and still find joy in this flourishing, even if it challenges us, even if it displaces us. Affirmative love doesn't take offense at freedom. It celebrates it because it understands that life is richer when it's not controlled. Nietzsche knew this type of love requires greatness of spirit. Most people seek in love an escape from suffering, a refuge against solitude, a certainty that tranquilizes. But the strong spirit is one that doesn't fear pain, that faces solitude, that lives without guarantees. Only this spirit is capable of loving affirmatively because it doesn't need the other as shield against life. It loves because it has already said yes to life itself. A clear example can be seen in relationships where pain doesn't destroy, but strengthens. When a couple goes through difficulties, losses, or misunderstandings, affirmative love doesn't take refuge in blame or accusations. It transforms suffering into learning, into new form of connection, into reason to grow. To love affirmatively is to refuse the temptation of resentment, is not to transform pain into prison, but into fuel. Nietzsche invites us to think of love not as refuge, but as creative risk. To truly love is to expose oneself, is to accept the vulnerability of surrendering without guarantees. But it's precisely in this risk that the beauty of life lies. Affirmative love doesn't flee from the danger of losing. It launches itself into danger because it knows intensity is worth more than security. It's the courage to say, even if I suffer, even if I lose, I choose to live this encounter because it's life in pure state. This love is also radical generosity. Not generosity as sacrifice, but as potency. Desire that the other grow, even if this growth takes them far from me. Desire that the other live fully, even if this challenges my comfort. To love affirmatively is to desire that the other be free, because only in freedom does life affirm itself with all its force. At the same time, Nietzsche alerts us. Affirmative love isn't passivity. It's combat, it's tension, it's game of forces, but it's combat without resentment, without desire to reduce the other. It's duel in which both come out greater and not diminished. It's encounter in which each brings their own force and instead of annulling it, puts it in movement together with the others. In the end, love as affirmation of life is an invitation to maturity. It's not the love of romantic illusions, nor the love of sick dependencies. It's the love that demands courage to look life in the face without masks. To love affirmatively is to accept that nothing is eternal, that everything can change, that even pain is part of it, and still choose to say yes. Nietzsche, if he could summarize, might say, to love is to affirm life twice. First in oneself, then in the other. And only those who have courage to say this double yes can know love in its most intense and creative form. The provocation that remains is direct. Do you love to flee from life, or do you love to affirm it? This question isn't just philosophical. It's practical, because it can transform the way you relate from now on. To love as affirmation of life isn't easy, but perhaps it's the most authentic and powerful way to live love. Throughout this journey, we've dived with Nietzsche into the darkest and most revealing side of love. We've discovered that behind sweet gestures, there can exist desire for possession, that silence can be more powerful than words, that dependence transforms passion into sickness, but also that when we live love with courage, it can become creation and affirmation of life. Nietzsche didn't write to comfort, but to awaken. He showed us that love isn't purity, nor redemption, but will to power, force that can both imprison and liberate. The true challenge is this, to recognize that love doesn't need to be crutch or prison, but conscious choice, act of greatness, risk that one accepts to live because it intensifies life. Creative and affirmative love is that which is born from abundance, not from lack, from courage, not from fear. To love, then, is to look at the other and say yes, not as escape, but as affirmation. And now, the question remains for you, what was the belief about love that most imprisoned you until today? And how can you transform it into freedom? What city are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know. If this content resonated with you in any way, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because your presence here strengthens this community that gathers to think, question, and transform ourselves together.